A remarkable interaction between Representative Tom Suozzi and Thomas Barthold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, perfectly captures the essence of Donald Trump's presidency. This exchange vividly demonstrates Trump's standard operating procedure, making grand, flashy promises to everyday Americans, then delivering something entirely different that primarily serves his wealthy donors. The legislation Trump had been celebrating as a massive victory for working-class Americans contains none of the benefits he repeatedly promised. Not the tax elimination on tips he touted, not the removal of taxes on overtime he pledged, not the exemption of Social Security from taxation he guaranteed. Every single worker-friendly provision Trump assured his supporters would be included is completely missing from the actual bill. What makes this revelation particularly damning is that it comes from a thoroughly non-partisan source. Thomas Barthold isn't some partisan critic, he's a respected non-partisan official whose objectivity has been recognized across party lines. Appointed Chief of Staff by Democrats in 2009, Barthold was subsequently retained by Republicans in 2014, with Paul Ryan and Orrin Hatch specifically praising him as a strong, non-partisan leader whose team produces quality, objective reports and analyses that inform major policy debates affecting American taxpayers. In other words, Barthold is precisely the kind of unbiased, credible authority whose assessment we should trust. Meanwhile, Trump continues making grandiose claims about helping workers, but when the actual legislation emerges, it fails to deliver on his promises. Why? Because Trump already got what he needed from voters and feels no obligation to follow through. This pattern of broken promises shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with Trump's first term. Remember his bold commitment to revitalize American manufacturing? The reality painted a starkly different picture. By the conclusion of his pre-pandemic presidency, U.S. manufacturing had actually slipped into recession. Federal Reserve data confirms manufacturing output declined by 1.3% in 2019, well before COVID-19 disrupted the economy. Even more telling, the manufacturing job creation during Trump's pre-pandemic years lagged behind the numbers achieved during Obama's second term. Trump ultimately presided over a net loss of 178,000 manufacturing jobs, hardly the renaissance he had promised. His healthcare pledges followed the same disappointing trajectory. Trump repeatedly vowed to unveil a spectacular healthcare plan that would be both more affordable and more comprehensive than the Affordable Care Act. Yet after 4 years in office, not a single page of this mythical plan materialized. When Republicans attempted to dismantle Obamacare, they offered absolutely nothing to replace it, potentially leaving tens of millions of Americans without any health coverage whatsoever. The much-hyped infrastructure initiative suffered a similar fate. Trump's grand promises to rebuild America's deteriorating roads and bridges never translated into action. Infrastructure Week became a running joke throughout his administration because it was perpetually announced but never implemented. The American Society of Civil Engineers continued to assign America's infrastructure a dismal D+ grade throughout Trump's entire presidency. Concrete evidence that his infrastructure promises remained unfulfilled. This consistent gap between Trump's public commitments and his administration's actual accomplishments reveals a troubling pattern of deception. Perhaps the most glaring example of Trump's broken promises was his much-celebrated middle-class tax cut. What Americans actually received was the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, legislation that overwhelmingly benefited corporations and wealthy individuals while providing minimal relief to middle-income families. Analysis from the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center revealed that by 2027, a staggering 83% of the benefits from this tax cut will flow to the top 1% of earners. The corporate tax reductions were structured to be permanent, while the modest individual tax benefits were deliberately designed to expire. This reveals the true priorities behind the legislation. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that Trump's signature tax law would add approximately $1.9 trillion to the national debt over a decade, dramatically increasing our deficit. Remember the administration's confident assertions that these tax cuts would essentially pay for themselves through accelerated economic growth? That promised economic miracle never materialized. In fact, the federal deficit increased annually throughout Trump's presidency, well before pandemic spending became a factor. So much for the Republican Party's long-proclaimed commitment to fiscal responsibility. When we examine the recent exchange between Representative Suozzi and Mr. Barthold, we witness this identical playbook unfolding once again. There remains a profound disconnect between Trump's public declarations and the actual legislation proposed. He positions himself as a champion of working Americans while crafting policies that primarily benefit wealthy donors. The Trump presidency presented to the public bears little resemblance to its actual policy priorities. The administration's rhetoric focused on helping service workers, factory employees, and seniors, but its legislation prioritized entirely different objectives. The genuine priorities of Trump's presidency were ensuring the wealthiest Americans maintained their reduced 37% tax rate instead of returning to the previous 39.6%, and preserving substantial loopholes that permit hedge fund managers to pay lower tax rates than their administrative assistants. For those who might consider this assessment unfair, let's examine what the current tax bill actually contains. It makes permanent the 2017 tax cuts, which, as previously established, predominantly benefited the affluent and major corporations. According to Barthold's testimony, the legislation before Congress extends permanently the top tax bracket at 37%. That's the real priority embedded in the bill's language. This approach epitomizes fake populism, publicly claiming to support working-class Americans while legislating primarily to benefit the ultra-wealthy. It means promising to drain the swamp while simultaneously filling your administration with lobbyists, industry insiders, and extraordinarily wealthy individuals. It involves rhetorically championing the forgotten men and women of America while implementing policies that ensure they remain forgotten. Perhaps the most offensive aspect isn't even the deception itself, but the underlying assumption that Americans are too uninformed to recognize what's happening. Trump repeatedly stands before crowds, making unfulfilled promises about tax-free tips and overtime, provisions entirely absent from any actual legislation, hoping nobody will verify his claims. Representative Suozzi did verify, exposing the truth. Trump isn't merely failing to deliver on his promises, he's actively implementing their opposite. He pledged tax relief for middle-class workers, but delivered benefits primarily for the wealthy. He guaranteed improved healthcare, but attempted to dismantle existing coverage protections. He promised manufacturing growth, but presided over manufacturing decline. There's a familiar saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." But what about being misled repeatedly, year after year? At some point, that's simply the experience of being a Trump supporter. One must wonder how many unfulfilled promises will be required before people finally recognize that the populist rhetoric is merely performative while the actual agenda remains consistent. Make commitments to working-class Americans, but deliver primarily for the wealthy. The evidence forms an unmistakable pattern throughout Trump's presidency. His tax policies disproportionately benefited corporations and high-income earners. His healthcare initiatives threatened coverage for millions without offering viable alternatives. His infrastructure plans never materialized despite constant promises. His manufacturing revival turned into manufacturing job losses. And now, his latest tax proposal follows the identical template. Public assurances about helping ordinary workers, while the actual legislation prioritizes maintaining reduced tax rates for the nation's highest earners. This disconnect between Trump's public statements and policy realities represents more than typical political exaggeration. It constitutes a fundamental deception about who benefits from his administration's actions. The legislation consistently favors wealthy donors and corporations while providing minimal assistance to the working-class voters who form a substantial portion of his base. As Tom Suozzi's questioning of Thomas Barthold clearly demonstrates, this pattern continues with Trump's most recent legislative priorities. The question remains whether voters will finally recognize this persistent disparity between promises and performance, or whether the cycle of unfulfilled commitments will continue unchallenged. At its core, Trump's presidency has consistently benefited the wealthy while merely offering empty rhetoric to everyone else.